Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Today I'm going to be doing the Jane Austen July tag in August, which is the most stereotypical Claire thing to ever do. But I missed Jane Austen July yet again this year, and I feel like I need an excuse. In fact, no, I never need an excuse. I wanted an excuse to talk about Jane Austen on my channel, and as I said, I didn't get a chance to do Jane Austen this year because I kind of had my Jane Austen July much earlier in the year when I went to Jane Austen's house, and I decided to reread all of her works towards the beginning of the year, and so by July I'd kind of, I guess, had my Jane Austen moment. So I just structured the year completely wrong. But I thought this was a lovely tag to kind of have a discussion, to open up a conversation about Jane Austen, share some of my favourite books, my characters, and just kind of get to know all of you in terms of your favourite things or least favourite things about Jane Austen. The first question is, what is your favourite Jane Austen book? And mine has to be, this feels a slightly basic answer, but it has to be Pride and Prejudice. And I kind of hate that it feels a bit basic because of course it's Pride and Prejudice, but after rereading it recently, the book is just so brilliant that it completely deserves to be so many people's favourite novel. It is witty, funny, a perfect characterisation of a family, and Jane Austen is just so brilliantly clever, and I think you get all of the best bits of Jane Austen in this novel, and it would definitely be my recommendation for anyone who hasn't yet picked up a Jane Austen book for whatever reason. I know it is probably the most well-loved Jane Austen, and for years I kind of said Emma because I'd kind of read Emma more recently, and I still love Emma. For me, they're kind of side by side, but after rereading Pride and Prejudice, you just can't get any better than this. Whenever I pick my favourite novel, I always have like a surge of panic because what about Persuasion? Persuasion is one of the best Jane Austen novels, it's one of my favourite books. And that's the thing with Jane Austen, all of her books are on my favourite books. Even ones I kind of love slightly less, like Northanger Abbey and Mansfield Park, I loved studying them, and in fact, the favourite Jane Austen to read and favourite Jane Austen to study are very different answers, but they're also brilliant. But yeah, if I have to pick one, it has to be Pride and Prejudice. The next question also makes me slightly anxious because it is, who is your favourite Jane Austen protagonist? And every time I read a Jane Austen novel, I swear I come back with a different favourite. But I have to say, they're probably the protagonists of two of my favourite Jane Austen novels. I love Lizzie in Pride and Prejudice, mainly because of the back and forth kind of wit and her interactions with her family, and the conversation she has with Mr. Darcy. But I think overall, my favourite protagonist has to be Emma in Jane Austen's Emma. I'm just so fond of Emma, even though Jane Austen, famously said that Emma is a heroine that only she would really like. I love how much she gets things wrong, but yet constantly thinks she's right about things. I love her dedication to her family and to her home. I love how much she just meddles in everything. She's just a really kind-hearted heroine in lots of ways, but also a little bit bitchy, I know she's got a good heart. Emma is just like, she gets things wrong, and I think she's probably the most human of Jane Austen's heroines, and I also see a bit of myself in Emma as well, and I just really love her. And I think, she wants to be a better person, she wants to get things right, but in her journey, she does get things wrong. And I also love her relationship with Mr. Knightley, and I am rather fond of Mr. Knightley. I feel like I've slightly married kind of a mix between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Knightley. And I love Emma. It's a brilliant book, and again, definitely one of my favourites. But I think, Emma, the character Emma, is one of the main reasons I love the novel so much. Then we have a brilliant question, and I would love to know what your answers were to this, and to all of them actually, because please let me know if you've done the video, because it is an old tag, I'm very late to the game, but I just have loved thinking about this answer. And the question is, which is always a useful thing to know in a tag, is name a book off your shelf that you think Jane Austen would wholeheartedly approve of. And I just knew this one automatically, and I hope she would approve, but it is one of my favourite novels, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. The reason I think Jane Austen would have approved of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is because of Susanna Clarke's brilliant, witty characterisation, and the language uses is just so carefully constructed, as well as highlighting some really important political themes, which I think Jane Austen also does in her writing. It's also obviously a satire of kind of a 18th century kind of Regency novel, and it's a form that Jane Austen obviously would have been very, very familiar with, and herself being a big reader, I think would have enjoyed those little references to the literature of her time. This book is also the perfect answer to a different question about a book that has been inspired by Jane Austen, and I think Susanna Clarke's writing and characterization definitely has been. And so I kind of think that Jane Austen might like to sit down and read this and really see the influence that she had on literature in this brilliant piece of fantasy writing. I'll just read you this tiny section because you'll definitely kind of feel the Jane Austen in it. It has been remarked by a lady infinitely cleverer than the present author how kindly disposed the world in general feels to young people who either die or marry. Imagine then the interest that surrounded Miss Wintertown. No young lady ever had such advantages before, for she died upon the Tuesday, was raised to life in the early hours of Wednesday morning, and was married upon the Thursday, which some people might thought too much excitement for 1 week. It is brilliant. The next question is kind of the opposite to that one, which is about the novels that I think Jane Austen would have hated. And we all know that Jane Austen was really sharp-tongued and, could be a bit mean. So I would have loved to have known more about the novels and the writers that she just really didn't like. When I've been kind of thinking about this question, for some reason, On the Road by Jack Kerouac keeps coming up, and I don't feel like she would particularly like Hemingway. I don't know, there's like a lot of kind of male writers, I'm just kind of like, yeah, she really wouldn't have liked those. But when I was thinking about it, I did come up with the Brontes, and I feel like Jane Austen and the Brontes, for some reason, often kind of get put together as like very different writers, and obviously they are, but mainly because I think people see kind of the Brontes as being wild and passionate, and then you've got the Jane Austen kind of polite society. And I actually don't think Jane Austen would have hated the Brontes, and the Brontes themselves, like Charlotte obviously did kind of criticise Jane Austen's view of society and the kind of the writing. But when I was thinking about it, I don't know if Jane Austen would have been a fan of Wuthering Heights. Now we know kind of Jane Austen liked the melodrama of, Anne Radcliffe, and so I think she wouldn't have been averse to reading something wild and passionate on the moors. But I think Jane Austen would have felt that the characters in here, if she was to write a novel, I think she would have done Wuthering Heights very differently. There'd be a lot more humour, and I think some of the characters would be more lovable with their humour. And I don't think she would have diluted it at all, but I think she would read this going, there are definitely some jokes or some witty remarks that could have been included that weren't included in Wuthering Heights. I also think that the female characters in this, I think she would have wanted to change around a bit. So I feel like Wuthering Heights is not a book that I think she would have hated, but I think she would have thought about it as being a book that could have been improved on, which feels very Jane Austen. Now we go back to characters with our favourite minor characters. My character stealing the limelight. You haven't been in a video for a long time. In terms of minor characters, I think Jane Austen does them just brilliantly. I'm just going to see where Sybil wants to go at the moment. She wants to go on the bookshelf, which is obviously perfect. One of my favourite things about Jane Austen is her minor characters, because she doesn't skim on their characterisation at all, regardless of if they only open their mouth once, if they, are just married to someone. They all have real characters and you can imagine them, and you can also kind of hear their own way of speaking, and who they are on the page very clearly, and none of them kind of blur or blend into each other unless they're kind of supposed to. One thing I have a really big soft spot for in Jane Austen is actually happily married characters, because they're actually few and far between. The majority of marriages in Jane Austen's work, not obviously the heroines, they're pretty ill-matched and hilarious, and so when you get a really happily married couple, they are something to look for, but they're also some of my favourite characters. For instance, we have Admiral and Mrs. Croft in Persuasion, and we have my very favourite, the Gardeners in Pride and Prejudice. The Gardeners are there to provide complete contrast to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and there's a brilliant line about Mr. Gardiner that he's basically like the opposite of his sister, Mrs. Bennet, and superior to her, I think, both in nature and education. And they are just loving, and they love Lizzie and Jane, and they provide advice, and, they also, Mrs. Gardiner and the trip to Pemberley, the whole thing is just lovely, and I want to spend more time with them, and they're in safe hands with the Gardiners, but they're just loyal and loving, and they help in times of need, and they're trustworthy, and the Bennets just really need people like that in their lives, because they certainly don't have it with their parents. I also really love the newly married Mr. and Mrs. Weston in Emma. And in fact, Emma has lovely side characters or minor characters. I also have a really fond kind of soft spot for Mr. Woodhouse. There are just so many brilliant characters. I'll also say, I think, one thing I would love to write on one day is actually the characterization of of husbands in Jane Austen, because some of my favourite characters are like Mr. Palmer, who is kind of awful, who's married to Mrs. Palmer, that is Mrs. Jennings' daughter in Sense and Sensibility. And he's just a horrible man, but I love that. I love that about him. I kind of like awful characters as well. You know, Mr. Elton is a terrible character, but also gives, I think, one of the best proposals to Emma in all of literature. It's the best. I mean, Jane Austen does awful proposals really well in many of her novels, but I think Mr. Elton's in Emma is probably the favourite. So I have minor characters I love to dislike. And I just realised I've answered another question, which is about the character that you love to hate. So skipping a question, looking at the characters that I love to hate, definitely Mr. Elton. I also really love to hate Sir Eliot in Persuasion, Sir Anne's father. And one thing I'll say actually about Jane Austen is how brilliantly she sets up characterization from page one. The beginning of Persuasion, I think, is one of the funniest and best bits of really displaying who a character is from the get-go, and you know exactly who that person is, and the person that they'll stay basically throughout the entire novel from the very first sentence. And I guess you have that in Pride and Prejudice as well, because you know the Bennets from the first page, you have their characterization down, and to be able to do that at the very beginning of a novel in such a short amount of time is just so clever. There are quite a few just people I just don't find lovable at all. Like Lucy Steele really gets on my nerves. Frank Churchill really gets on my nerves too. I feel like I like Frank Churchill more than I like Lucy Steele, but I really dislike Lucy Steele. I'm really not a fan of Isabel Thorpe. In fact, I don't even love these people. I just find them despicable. In terms of the people who I really should hate, but people I end up liking, I am kind of fond of Mary Crawford, just because the characterization, I feel like I've said characterization a million times in this video, so I apologise, but the way that Jane Austen portrays her as a character is very similar actually to Lizzie, and even in the words that is kind of being used to describe her. And you kind of have two characters in obviously in different novels. Mary Crawford's obviously in Mansfield Park, but you have these two characters with remarkably similar kind of attributes, but looking at how they can be presented differently and how they can be kind of bad as well as good. And I like that Jane Austen, has picked, I guess, one of her best loved characters, even though she wouldn't necessarily have known that at the time, but she's picked this brilliant character and twisted her into a not very nice character, Mary Crawford, and I just think that speaks a lot of her genius in writing. Now, the last question I'm going to answer as a part of this tag is name a novel that I think was somehow inspired by Jane Austen. Alongside Jonathan Strange, I've also picked The Other Bennet Sister, which is obviously definitely inspired by Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I haven't yet read this, but I'm really excited to, because it looks at Mary as, the forgotten other Bennet sister. Please let me know if you've read The Other Bennet Sister, because I'm really intrigued by it, especially because at the moment I'm reading a history book by Janice Hadlow, which I'm loving, called The Strangest Family, about George III, Queen Charlotte, and obviously the Hanoverians. And Janice Hadlow actually references Mary in this, and obviously Mary is the inspiration behind the novel, as a blue stocking who was suppressed by her family, or could be a blue stocking, and she talks about her in relation to another kind of blue stocking. Let me find this bit. Poor Mary Bennet, whose embarrassing attempts at intellectual assertion were ignored and whose accomplishments belittled by her indifferent family, is left at the Pride and Prejudice with only her books and piano for company. So I have a feeling that the other Bennet sister is kind of going to right the wrongs of Mary, and so I'm intrigued what life Janice Hadlow fleshes out for her in the novel. So there are all my answers to the Jane Austen July tag. One day I'll actually do something Jane Austen related in July. Please let me know some of your answers to the questions in the comments, or point me to the direction of your video. I'm especially interested in people's favourite minor characters, because even now it's been a few questions obviously since I answered that question, I keep remembering different people and want to add people to my answer. And I think that's really the joy of Jane Austen, is that there's always so much to discover and come back to. So I hope I've been able to share a bit of my love of Jane Austen's writing and her books in this video. And I think we have to do an emoji, let's do a pen for Jane. A pen or cup of tea, I'll let you decide. I've just realised I've gone this entire video without wearing my bonnet or talking about my bonnet. So now I'm going to have to go and read some Jane Austen wearing a bonnet, because it's the least Jane deserves. Thank you so much for watching this video and letting me ramble on about Jane Austen yet again, and I will see you very soon in another video.